This video is an overview of Chapter 4, Data Visualization. Now, data visualization is the visual representation of data, as it sounds. Sometimes it's simply referred to as graphics, and you have other names as the visual representation of quantitative information, as Edward Tufte once called it. But overall, when you say data visualization, that's rather all-encompassing. Now, there is a difference between data visualization and information visualization, and I've seen those terms used interchangeably, but they shouldn't be. Data visualization itself is more the visualization of quantitative or qualitative data done through some sort of software or coding language. So, for example, Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets for spreadsheet software, as well as languages like R, Julia, and Python for coding and data visualization. Whereas information visualization is typically done by a graphic designer, and you can think of things like infographics or flowcharts, things like that. But the issue with information visualization is even though it may contain data, oftentimes it needs to be updated manually by someone who has those sorts of visual graphical skills to be able to create a depiction that is similar to, for example, an infographic. However, data visualization, you really need to simply rerun the data and any pre-processing you've done with those data. And when you do that, your visualization will update in effect. There's also two principal types of data visualization. There's exploratory visualization and explanatory visualization. So exploratory is part of something called EDA, exploratory data analysis. And not only can you use functions like the 5-number summary to look at the dispersion of your data or to seek out the variance of your data, and you can look at sort of quantitative representations of your data set, but you can also visualize your data to be able to understand its distribution and other qualities or patterns that you might not have noticed if you're only looking at, say, some summary statistics. Now, that's exploratory analysis. Typically, it's quick and dirty, quote unquote. You want to share it with your colleagues or maybe domain experts, and it's not really something that you want to publish because you haven't put a lot of time into it. You haven't thought about the different audiences that might perceive it or try to interpret it, and so you really haven't. Empathy wasn't exactly a guiding principle in exploratory analysis. It's really for you, and it's really for colleagues who also are highly data and data visualization literate. Now, explanatory visualization is really when you're talking about publications. It's meant for broad audiences, and it's something that you do when you're creating a final report, when you're visualizing data for an executive, and in other words, you want it to be interpretable, highly polished, and in other words, efficient, effective, and elegant. So, we're actually just going to show a couple of what you might call an exploratory data analysis in this chapter, and then we start getting into explanatory analyses and explanatory visualizations in Chapter 5, Best Practices. So the first thing about data visualization, and this has been kind of central to the message I've shared throughout all of these reviews in chapters 1 through 3, central to that is kind of cleaning and arranging your data, summarizing your data in a way that's going to make it conducive to better visualization. And sometimes that might actually take, some sort of a summarization. You might get for example, the mean or the median, and you want to be able to visualize those. And so that takes some preparation. And so one of the key things that we can do is actually sorting or arranging your data. And it's very easy to do in spreadsheet software like Excel, like Google Sheets. So let's have a look at it. So if I look at column C, unique words, and I can actually highlight that entire column, and then in the upper right, there's the sort and filter button with editing. If I click on that, I can sort from smallest to largest or from largest to smallest. So this is called decreasing or descending order, as opposed to smallest to largest, which is called ascending order. We're going to do descending. In other words, we're going to have the largest vocabularies at the top. Now, you'll get this sort warning, and it's asking you if you only want to sort just this column, or if you want to sort all of these other columns that are connected to it. In other words, do you want these unique word counts to remain connected to both the artist and the era? And of course, you'll want to do that probably in most instances of arranging your data, because otherwise, then these unique word counts will no longer connect to the artist. So we're going to say expand the selection. In other words, expand the columns. So cool. That went from, again, descending order. And that was just an example of what I had been typically doing to prepare the data for these demos I've done in the previous videos. But what we're actually going to do is sort by era. And this is also the examples. These are also the examples provided in Chapter 4. So if I sort by era and I click Arrange, let's do smallest to largest. So we're going to start off with likely the 1980s, right? Certainly a few hits in 1979, but yeah. So what we can do here is, for example, let's say we wanted to get the average unique word count by decade. So in this case, we have 1980 going down here, 1990, 2000, and of course 2010, and soon we'll be getting into the 2020s. So if I wanted to, I could just simply click on the value 1980, and I'm simply referencing these cells 1990 and 2000, as well as 2010. So now we've got our decades, aka era, and those are the unique values that we can find there. Could I have used a function like distinct to be able to get these values? Yes, I could have, but that's all right. I'm just really showing you how to do this very, very manually. So now we want the average lyrics. So how do we do that? Well, because we arranged our data, this should be relatively easy. So we simply press equals to open up a formula. We'll use function average, spelled correctly, of course. And then we're going to simply select, not A through, well, actually, we can just simply change this. We'll select rows 2 through 9. And in this case, I'm going to close that and make sure that we're referencing the right cells, in this case, C. Okay, so the average lyrics in the 1980s, the average breadth of unique lyrics in rappers' vocabularies was 4,424.5. We've got a little warning there. The formula in the cell refers to a range that has additional numbers adjacent to it. Okay, well, thanks. It is good to double check and make sure we're working with numbers here. Whoa. Looks like we're not. Not that that really changes what we're doing. So cool. Now, if we wanted the average for the 1990s, we simply start with the 1990s. That's GZA. And we go all the way down to DMX, who had the smallest vocabulary in the 90s, and also one of the smallest vocabularies in pretty much among all rappers. And so let's make sure that these are also considered numbers as well. Okay, cool. We'll ignore those warnings for now, but ultimately we're getting what we want. And so we also want, of course, average for the aughts, or 2000. So let's do that. It starts with A$AP Rock at the top, and we work our way to Juicy J. I've not had the pleasure of listening to Juicy J, however. And, of course, we'll do it again one more time with the 2010s. And again, the reason we're able to do this is because we have, in effect, ordered these using this arrange by ascending an era. So that was also sort of a very manual grouping operation. So there we have it. We have a kind of a summary where we've grouped by decade and we've gotten the average lyrics for each of those decades. You can actually see it decreasing in 2010, where it was about its highest in the aughts, and it seemed to be a little bit less in 1990, but not significantly. We really see a drop in the breadth of vocabulary once we enter artists in the 2010s. So interesting. Again, it's a little bit more evidence that there was some sort of a golden era of hip-hop. But of course, that does not account for the fact that in 2000, we had lyrical diversity. And, you know, who says lyrical diversity necessarily means awesome music? So, cool. So there's another way to do this that's much less manual, and it's called creating a pivot table. So what I'm going to do is actually highlight all of these data. And very simply, I'm going to select Insert and then Pivot Table. And it's going to ask if I want to, first of all, it's going to confirm that I'm using cells A1 through C160, and that's totally fine. And we also want to say that we're using a new worksheet. If you have an existing worksheet, of course, you can do that as well. And your worksheet tabs can be selected here at the bottom. So there we have a pivot table, but there's not really anything in it. So that's because over on the right side, we have columns, values, rows, and filters. And so we actually need to take the three variables that we have here, era, artist, and unique words, and then we need to be able to move those in the appropriate box. Where do we want our columns? Where do we want our rows? And just as described in the very first chapter, of course, we have this kind of tripartite essential ingredients that are the sine qua non, if you will, of a data table. So, cool. Let's do era in columns. Actually, let's do that in rows. And let's do artist also. And so here we can see 1980, 1990, 2000. So that's nicely organized for us already. Precisely what we did very manually in this lyrics sheet. I'm actually going to rename this to pivot table so we can recognize it a little bit better. And what's more, I'm going to move unique words into values. And this is providing the sum. Now this might be cut off the screen a bit, and I do apologize for that, but there is a small arrow next to it, and we can click on value field settings. So this allows us to not simply show the sum, we can actually show the average. So in this case, it's still providing these unique words, but now it's actually providing the average for the entire decade and everyone inside of it. If you want to take it a bit further, you can also add things like filters. So if we click and drag the variable era into filters, we can make it so that we only want to see, let's say, 1980 and 1990. Now, if we want to show everything, we could do that as well. Something happened there. That was interesting. I kind of lost it. Not sure what went on, but that's okay. Anyways, so obviously this is a much quicker process, and you can do a lot more data transformations and summaries with a pivot table, which lends itself to more quickly preparing your data and making sure that there's no human errors. We could have introduced several human errors here by using a pivot table. And you can also turn these data, in effect, into a data visualization. So how do we create a data visualization? Well, I'm actually going to use the data visualization that we kind of manually put together here. And what you do is simply highlight the rows and columns that contain the values and the variables that you want to represent in your data. Once you've highlighted those, you simply click, just like inserting a pivot table. Now we can insert charts. Now there's a bunch of shortcuts here, or you can click the down arrow and we can click a different type of chart if you wanted to. And of course there's recommended charts too. So what this is doing is looking at the type of data you have, and it's saying, okay, we have decade, which is, it looks quantitative, but let's see what it recommends for that, since that's a number. And we also have obviously numeric data with the average lyrics. So here's what's interesting is it's giving us a line chart, which is excellent for showing data over time. So I think this was an excellent prediction for what we might have used. And it does show that dip very clearly in the 2010s when lyrical diversity begins to decline. However, I'm going to go with a bar chart, and that's because even though these are kind of representative of time and we are looking at data over time, we only have 4 categories, and it should really be more treated, as I've said in previous videos, as categorical data. So in this case, the 1980s is one category, the 1990s is another category. So these are just multiple levels in that categorical variable. So then I press OK after I have the visualization I want. Now let's say that's something that I didn't want, and that's totally fine too. We can click on recommended charts and we can go into all charts, and here we can get, our data isn't exactly conducive to a lot of these chart types, and that's why there are recommended ones, as well as courses like this, workshops like this to be able to help with that. So we'll stick again with the bar charts, and you can modify a few things, but before we do that, it's good to look at the chart elements. You find that by clicking on this plus button and in the upper right of your visualization, and this will allow you to add or take away, for example, chart title. Let's get rid of that. Okay, let's add it again because it is important. We have axis titles or axes titles. The axes themselves we can get rid of, but we obviously want to keep for contextualization of our data. And you can add other things too, like data bars, legends, grid lines are obviously very important, but also they can interrupt or make too busy your visualization, so you want to make sure your grid lines are, even though they're important, they're kind of the last thing you want to emphasize. And there's also trend lines, but this seems to be about enough. So simply double-clicking on your visualization or your chart element oftentimes allows you to edit it. So in this case, we'll do lyrical. And I've got a big microphone in my way, so apologies if I type a bit slower. Lyrical diversity by decade, and we can label this, of course, decade, and we can label that unique lyrics. Kind of turning my head sideways to see if I got that right. Okay, cool. You can do other things too, just like if it were in Word, you can treat it where you actually control the colors. Now, it's not a bad idea to go with black, or we can go with something like a bit less harsh, and that way you're focusing on making the data pop, but you can still see the title. And I personally like to move titles in the upper left, and you'll know exactly why in Chapter 5. But that's exactly right, how you can change these essentially in the same way that you would change anything in a Microsoft Word document, a PowerPoint presentation, etc., etc. So, but what's more is that we have all of these other chart elements too. So here we have the actual grid lines. Now, if we wanted to focus on, say, here we can get the entire series, but if we wanted to focus on one series, in this case 1990, we can just double click on that and we'll only affect this bar. Again, we can highlight the y-axis values and their labels, and the x-axis labels, and also the x-axis title and y-axis title, and again, grid lines and the actual data themselves. So what you do to be able to adjust these and fine-tune them is automatically you'll have this kind of, by double clicking on any of those elements, you'll have all of these options opened up to you, and that's really where you're going to add polish to your data. Already we've got a pretty nice visualization here, but there are a couple of things that I would add to it, and a couple of things that I would probably de-emphasize, small changes like that. But otherwise, it actually kind of right off the bat with just a few minor changes isn't too bad. So that's creating a data visualization, the ability to fine-tune your data visualization, and what's more, again, using things like sort and filter, and also creating pivot charts to be able to use summary statistics that describe groupings of your data. This is certainly a much easier breakdown of this sort of 159 different artists that we have listed here. That is Chapter 4, and thanks for watching. Have fun making your first visualizations, and get started doing a bit of fine-tuning too. See if you want to experiment with the different options that you have on the right side when it says format data points, format data series, format plot areas, etc., etc.